The United Arab Emirates says it will leave the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries from the 1st of May. This is a heavy blow for the organization at a time when the Iran war is already causing a shock to energy supplies that is reverberating around the globe. Analysts say the UAE exit represents a big win for US President Donald Trump. Mr. Trump accusing the organization of, quote, ripping off the rest of the world by inflating oil prices. The move comes after the UAE criticized Arab states for not doing enough to protect it from numerous Iranian attacks during this war. Oil futures up more than 3%, WTI around $100 per barrel, while Brent is at about $111 per barrel. And for more on this story, as well as others, Phillip Cornell, he's Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Centre, joins us live from Mangal in Sri Lanka. Mr. Cornell, thanks for joining us this evening. Is this a win for Donald Trump?
Thank you, Wei Sue. Indeed it is. Donald Trump has been accusing OPEC of keeping prices high, even as the U.S. is, quote unquote, protecting GCC states. And so this represents really a move within the UAE of those factions inside the UAE that are arguing that the U.S. Should be going further against Iran and really is demonstrating how the post-crisis reality will see many GCC countries, starting with the UAE and perhaps others, becoming much closer to Washington.
But if we define a win as lower oil prices for Mr. Trump, how will the pullout of the UAE get these lower prices for Donald Trump?
Well, traditionally, OPEC has been a cartel. Its job has been to put a floor under prices by organizing supply cuts in order to keep those prices higher. So in principle, as the organization weakens, there will be less incentive to keep prices cut. The reality is a little bit more complicated. The real engine inside OPEC is Saudi Arabia, which is the only country that has significant differences, let's say, the ability to pump much more, spare capacity of production. But from a political point of view, this is really a blow to OPEC and, in principle, might make it harder for them to buoy prices in the future.
All right, and final question on this before we move on. The link between U.S. support militarily for the Gulf with OPEC then controlling oil prices insofar as it can control oil prices. Both the UAE and Saudi Arabia, relative to other Gulf states, have actually been, over this war on Iran, relatively aligned with the United States. Where do you see Saudi Arabia acting on this with the UAE pulling out? Final question before we move on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think within the GCC states, there has been some debate about their reaction to this war in general. Many have blamed the U.S., let's say, for starting it alongside Israel and causing such upheaval to their economic models, which have relied on stability and continued investment. On the other hand, there has been another faction, I think, which we can see now is more pervasive within the leadership, which has said, okay, now that this war has started, we need to, quote unquote, finish the job. And so they have been in Washington over the past month or two. The embassies of the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been going to the White House and urging them to continue and not to cut a deal that leaves Iran in charge of the strait. And so I think we can see now that particularly in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, is likely to be the policy going forward. And I think in the longer term, that shows, again, a longer term alignment between the GCC states, particularly those two pivotal ones, and Washington.
All right. Let's bring the questions closer to within the region. So militarily, Gulf states attacked, U.S. military bases attacked because they are in the Gulf. But in Asia, the real pain lies in shocks to energy supplies. So crude, refined crude, as well as LNG. Each country here trying to manage in its own ways. Okay, it's 8 weeks and a day since the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed. 2 months since the start of the US and Israeli strikes on Iran. Where are we on energy havoc in Asia?
Yeah, so we have been going through what I would say is a bit of a calm before a storm. A lot of the disruptions that we've seen on the ground in the first couple of weeks in Asia were largely the result of panic buying or hoarding on the side of consumers. So a lot of the queues that we saw in petrol stations in the first couple of weeks across Asia, that was the reason. It wasn't necessarily a physical shortage. However, of course, prices have been moving up. And not just benchmark prices, if we look at things like Brent or WTI crude oil prices, but specific both product prices and specific crude, let's say Oman crude. So some of those prices have become things like $160, $170 a barrel for Middle East crude. And product prices for things like diesel and jet fuel have surpassed $200 a barrel. So the price impact has been serious. What we're seeing now is really the beginning of physical supply shortages. Many Asian governments acted early and used demand restraint measures. So, for example, rationing, as we just heard about in your packets in Myanmar, but also trying to have less work days. So, for example, keeping Wednesdays as non-work days for public workers. So that has helped to keep demand down, which is now down about 2.5 million barrels per day in Asia. But what's coming now week by week as we move into May is going to be physical supply shortages of specific fuels in specific countries that are especially vulnerable. That means things like jet fuel, which is going to be the most visible in terms of its impacts over the next couple of weeks. And we already see flight cancellations across Asia. But it's also meaning things like fertilizers, diesel, which is heavily impacted and very important for transport, and things like LPG, which is critical for cooking, and where we've seen physical supply shortages in places like India and Indonesia. So depending on the countries, different fuels are seeing different shortages and price spikes.
So even hypothetically, and this is not happening, the Strait of Hormuz miraculously opens now. Ships feel fully confident of sailing safely through the Strait of Hormuz. When do we see, I suppose, things, prices, supply situations returning to relative normal in Asia? What sort of timeline would you put on this?
Yeah, so the delay which has kept things relatively calm over the past 6 to 8 weeks is because it's taken time for inventories of fuels within the system to be depleted. Some of those inventories are things like fuel tanks on land, and some of them are ships that were in transit over the past several weeks. If the ships were start to sail through Hormuz tomorrow, that gap would need to be filled. So it will take time for ships to reach their destinations after leaving Hormuz. It will take time to replenish existing stocks inside the system. So depending on what kind of fuel we're talking about, which markets in Asia we're talking about, it could still be a 6 to 8 week delay until supplies really start coming back after shipping has been totally reopened. And as you say, that's a very optimistic situation because as the negotiations over Hormuz seem to be blocked or at least stalled for the moment, it's hard to know when shipping is going to restart again.
Thanks for joining us, Phillip Cornell, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. Thank you.